Hello and welcome to Brandtuned, a podcast for people like you, marketers, designers and founders looking to build a great brand that's differentiated and distinctive. It's hosted by me, Shireen Smith, intellectual property lawyer, author and marketer. Hi. This is a quick follow-up episode to Stocktake on last week's podcast with Sean Adams. Sean is an internationally recognized graphic designer and chair of graphic design at Art Center College of Design in California. He has a wealth of experience in identity design and has written several books. Sean's ideas gave me some new insights that I want to share with you. Firstly, I found it interesting that Sean recommends taking clients on the design journey, showing them iterations of the work as it progresses, explaining decisions and so on, rather than doing a big reveal at the end of the design process. I've been through a few branding experiences in my time and never received the sort of explanations about design decisions that in hindsight I wish I had received. I'd have been less likely to make changes to my designs down the line if I properly understood why the designer made those choices in the first place. The drawback to having a big reveal at the end of the process is that it's much more likely that the client won't like the designs. I gather this is something designers find upsetting and tend to take personally. If the client rejects the designs, it feels like a rejection of the designer because the designs are an extension of them. While I myself have usually accepted the designs I've been given on the assumption that the designer knows best, that doesn't mean I've not been baffled by the design decisions. For example, I was using turquoise, brown, and gold as my colors for 8 years when the designer I'd engaged for a brand refresh for a totally different reason decided that the brand colors needed to change and that I should instead use maroon and purple with a shade of orange. No reasons were given, and to this day, I really don't understand why she felt that it was necessary for me to abandon the colors I was previously using. So I really liked the importance that Sean placed on clients understanding design decisions. His refreshingly client-focused approach shows real empathy for clients. At the end of the day, it's the client's business. So if the client wants a particular color, then Sean will accommodate the request and work with that color instead of imposing a color the client dislikes. As Sean's approach is so collaborative, it means the client gets explanations as to why the designer is making the choices they're making. There are no surprises, which there would be if you did a big reveal at the end. So you're much more likely to get buy-in from the client using Sean's approach. Creating an identity necessarily involves educating the client. People often have questions after all. I believe that if a designer can communicate well and also talk about the IP dimension, they'd be the ideal advisor for their clients, especially their early stage clients who, in my experience, often have many questions that involve IP predominantly. If we pause to consider what the word designer means, it's clear that it's a person who plans the look or workings of something before it's made. As Steve Jobs put it, design isn't just about how something looks, it's about how it works. So while the word is commonly associated with graphic designers, in truth, it includes anyone who understands and advises on business structure. They can help plan how a business should work in all respects, not just visually. I often help my clients to create their identities and bring in a graphic designer to implement the visual aspects of the identity. While in theory, founders can outsource the visual identity designs to a designer on Upwork, as they're often unaware what works and what doesn't when it comes to identity design, I think it's actually best that they work with a designer who has a proper understanding of brand identity rather than, using someone on Upwork. For example, while meaningful imagery, such as a picture of books in a logo for a library, may seem appropriate to a client, they need to be educated to realize why it's not a good approach to identity design. And that calls for an experienced identity designer rather than a designer that's just going to follow orders, take orders, so to speak, and produce whatever the client asks for. Had IBM used a picture of an adding machine in its logo, how suitable would its visual identity have been by now? Such a descriptive identity design would need a complete overhaul a few years down the line. It isn't the right approach to brand identity design because it will have too short a shelf life. You're creating the face of the business, after all. It shouldn't limit the business. It should allow room for it to grow beyond its early manifestation. This was a revelation to me because I hadn't realized that people make this same mistake about visual elements as they do with names and taglines, where the tendency is to opt for descriptive, meaningful names rather than distinctive ones. Just as descriptive designs are not the right approach to identifiers, so descriptive names are the wrong approach to naming because you can't uniquely own generic names. The law leaves such names free for all to use. Given that visual identity needs to be permanent, I'm often baffled that designers radically change the visual identity of established businesses just because the business's strategy changes. Tweaks to the identity should be all that's done unless there is something radically transformed about the business. For example, say a business decides to be a premium luxury brand instead of low cost, then clearly a complete change of identity might be appropriate. Beyond such exceptional cases, I doubt that a totally new identity is ever desirable for an established business. Branding as a concept originates from the days when livestock had numbers burnt onto their skin to identify who they belonged to. The branding of the livestock was permanent. So by analogy, when a business is designed, its identifying marks should surely be treated as permanent once a business gets off the ground and is beyond its early stages. From an IP perspective, it isn't a good idea to radically change the identity just for change's sake, because a business would have trademark registrations in place. Changes to its identifying elements would necessitate new trademark registrations worldwide, which can be an expensive exercise. I sometimes come across businesses that manage to secure a trademark term using a logo that they then change. They either don't update their registration with the new logo or find that they can't secure registration of the mark with their new logo because it's a stylized word mark that is not sufficiently distinctive. The upshot in both cases is that they don't have a unique identifier. So they will discover that they can't stop a competitor using a similar mark, even though the business is losing sales. I suspect more companies would have memorable visual identities if it wasn't so common for them to chop and change their identity every few years. However, whether because business owners get bored with their identity designs and actively look to change them every so often, or because their designers change their identity to reflect a new brand strategy, identities are rarely permanent. Yet it's best to leave designs unchanged. Designers want to put their own stamp on the identity, while the business owner who sees the designs day in and day out gets bored and wants a change. This overlooks the fact that customers only occasionally see the branding. The visual identity is what makes it easier for customers to remember and recognize a brand. People may recognize brands by their name or an identifier that's lodged itself in their memory, even though they don't know a lot about the brand. So it's important to leave the identifying elements that characterize a business unchanged so you don't disturb memory structures. In the early years of a business, it's fair enough to make radical changes to the identity, but once a business is established, it should regard its identifiers as permanent fixtures. Changing the identity radically is the equivalent of a person having extensive plastic surgery and becoming unrecognizable to people who know them. Designers should exercise their creativity in other ways than changing the brand identity. For example, they could suggest novel ways in which to signify the brand in advertisements or on social media, so it looks identifiably like itself, using its various identifiers in different configurations. As the question whether it's a good idea for the branding to change fascinates me, I broached the subject with Sean during the interview. His starting point is to consider how much equity there is in an existing identity and whether it's good equity. Also, if an organization has completely changed so that its structure and goals are quite different to what it started out with, then it's acceptable to change the identity, said Sean. And if the identity was poorly designed in the first place, perhaps it makes sense to make a complete change. Sean did mention that in the big brand programs he's worked on, he's either tried to resurrect the old logo, which had equity and was abandoned for some reason, or to find a way to make it more stable. He'd like designers to focus more on the business goals than on whether they can make something look cool. An interesting insight I got from the interview is that a good logo will always pose a question. For example, the Apple identity has that little bite out of it, which forces you to think a little bit. The more you think, the more it strikes, the more it sticks in your head. It takes time for companies to stick in the mind and to be associated with an identifying element. For example, McDonald's can now use its Golden Arches M symbol on its own without the McDonald's name and be recognized. A brand can only do that once it has enough brand equity in its identifiers to be able to pull that off. So repeated exposure is essential, as is a strategy that focuses on the steps to take to own its identifiers. That's necessary because it's important to prevent competitors using similar identifiers. It's only by ensuring that identifiers you're using are unique to the brand that you can hope to be identifiable through those identifiers down the line. So Coca-Cola had a long-term strategy that took 15 years or so before it became uniquely associated with its bottle shape. That's when it could trademark the shape. It's absolutely essential to think about ownership and protection if you want to emulate the likes of McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Nike, and other well-known brands that have built up brand equity in their visual identifiers. The brand-tuned program that we've created is a 101 on branding that includes much needed education in intellectual property. The next cohort starts in January 2023. There's going to be a webinar on the 23rd of November, so just register your interest by visiting the brand-tuned accreditation page and scroll down and you'll see a section to register your interest, and we'll send you details of the webinar nearer the time. Or if it's easier, just register to receive the newsletter and I'll be notifying the list about the upcoming webinar soon. In conclusion, make sure your visual identity is different to what everyone else is doing, so you stand out rather than blending in. And IP is essential to that exercise. That's it for this week. Do subscribe to the brand-tuned newsletter to get weekly updates. I'd also love to get your feedback. Just send me an email to info@brandtuned.com. Finally, if you liked the episode, please do share it with your friends and colleagues and review it on iTunes or whichever platform you use to listen to podcasts. If you leave us a 5-star review, it means more people will listen and we can spread the word much more quickly about the podcast. Thank you and bye for now.